Welcome to a Git video where I'm going to talk about the commands git remote, git fetch, git merge, and git pull. My name's Dan, and let's get started. So I've done a little bit of prep work for this video. Might be hard to see, but there's actually two tabs here, two independent shells. So this is Dan at Willow, which is the name of my machine. And in this other tab I have Bob at Willow. And so Bob is a different user that I've created just to sort of show you how Git repos can interact with each other. So Bob doesn't really have anything in his home directory. So we're just going to quickly we're going to quickly clone the trick repo, which I've used in other videos, which the user Dan already has, you can see here. So switch back to the Bob tab and do git clone. And we're going to clone the trick repo in another location on his hard drive in Bob's home directory. And while that's going on, I just want to briefly catch you up if you haven't seen the other videos. Basically, this trick repo I've used in other videos, and I've made a couple commits in them. So if we look at the git log, you'll see, I guess it's just one commit here. So according to this repo, if I do a git status in Dan's area, it says I am ahead of origin master by one commit. So that'll be important later when we start having these repos interact. But okay, so if I switch over to Bob's side, we now have a trick repo. And if we look at the git log, we notice that we don't see the commit that Dan made, which makes sense because we cloned from GitHub's origin. And so origin is the default remote for the operations that you're doing in Git repo. And there is a command called git remote, and it accepts another command called show, and then you just give it the name of the remote. And this will show you information about the git remote called origin. And you can see that the origin is GitHub. And this is the same origin for Dan's side. If I switch over here and do git remote show origin, I get the exact same thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to have Bob and Dan's repos interact. And before I do that, I just want to point out real quick that and go over the git fetch command. So when you type git fetch with no arguments and it returns nothing, that means that nothing was fetched. And the fetch command, you can think of fetch as basically download. So git fetch will bring data from the remote locally over your internet connection, or if you're on the same machine, it obviously doesn't go out to the internet. But what the most important thing about git fetch is that git fetch cannot change any of the files in your working tree. So a fetch, you can think of a fetch as a passive operation. It downloads content that Git needs to know where remote branches are and grab new commits and stuff, but it doesn't apply it to your working tree, which means, it downloads information and it shoves it in the .git folder, and then it doesn't do anything else. So I'm going to talk a little bit more. That's a little bit confusing to people at first, especially because a lot of Git tutorials introduce git pull first. And I really think that's a bad idea because pull has a lot of assumed behavior. And so I'm going to go over git fetch and git merge first because I think that's going to be more useful to the understanding of Git. So what we're going to do in Bob's repo is we're going to create a new remote called Dan. And this remote is it's going to be just like Origin is, except it's a completely different remote. And that's what's cool about Git is you can have as many remotes as you want, and it's easy to collaborate with other people. So let's just go ahead and do it right now. So let's see. Well, actually, real quick, before I do that, let me just show you the current remote branches that we have. And the way you can do that is just by passing the -a for all flag to git branch. And it shows you the hidden ones. So by default, if you do git branch with no arguments, all you get are your local branches. But git branch -a will show your remote tracking branches as well. So, for example, this origin/master is Bob's trick repo's representation of what origin master contains. And I realize that's a weird way to say that, but I wanted to be clear because this origin master is the state of origin master is dependent on your last fetch operation. Meaning, if I get on a plane with this computer, I did a git fetch while I had internet. I go off on a plane, I go on a desert island, and I don't have any connection to origin master. Well, my origin master locally isn't going to keep up with what's actually happening on origin master unless I can download that data occasionally, and that's done through a git fetch. So you notice I'm doing a git fetch here and I'm not getting any more information, but let's say a commit happened while I was talking. If I did a git fetch, you'd see a download operation, and that would apply to this origin master. And I realize that might be a little confusing right now if you're new to Git, but we'll go over more of the implications of that as we go forward. So what I was going to do, and we're going to do that right now, is create the new remote. So we do that by doing git remote add, and then we give it what we want to call the remote. So this is our choice. I could call it Danny, or I'm just going to call it Dan. So git remote, and then you give it the second argument to the git remote add command is the URL. So this could be anywhere that you have a connection to. It could be GitHub, it could be on another machine that you SSH to, as in, if I'm Bob and I want to log into a fake machine called other machine, and then I give it the path to repo. But in this example, it's all on the local hard drive. So all I'm going to do is give it the path. Git remote add Dan, and then the URL, which since it's local is just the path. Hit enter. And now I have a new remote called Dan, and I can do a git remote show Dan, and it'll show information just like Origin, except this one's local. So now if I do a git fetch, what do you think is going to happen? We have two remotes now. And this is a thing, nothing happens here, and this is one of the things I find confusing about Git. There's a lot of assumed behavior. So git fetch, without any arguments, is going to act on Origin. And so if you want to fetch another remote, you need to just specify it. So git fetch Dan. And you'll notice, instead of nothing, we get the printout that says the remote is actually Dan in /home Dan dev trick, and it packs up the data it needs and it sends it over the hard drive to my area, which is /home Bob trick. And now it's saying I have a new branch, and that branch is a remote tracking branch called Dan/master. So if I do git branch -a, we'll notice that in addition to what I had before, which is origin/master, now I have a new remote called Dan/master. And because I did a git fetch and I actually pulled the latest commits from Dan, pull, don't think pull in the git pull sense. I just mean they were downloaded. Now I actually have access to the git log associated with those branches. So, if I do a git log, normally it's going to act on my current branch, which is master, and we'll see commit F2CA. But I can also do git log and pass it the branch I want to look at. So if I pass it Dan/master, we'll notice that we're seeing the git log of our representation of Dan/master, and it's at this commit, which is the exact same commit that if we switch over to the Dan side is at the head, at the top here. So I'll switch back to Bob's terminal. And so that's a little confusing at first because git log, pretty much any git command, if you don't give it other arguments, is going to act on your current branch. And that's what I sort of call an assumed behavior that isn't exactly clear when you first start using git. So, in this case, git branch is master. And so git log with no arguments will act on the master branch as I have it locally. Okay. So one thing I want to point out real quick here too is that everything we did here on the Bob side, where we added a remote called Dan, and we downloaded Dan's representation of master, required no active participation from the developer Dan at all. And so this is what's kind of cool about Git is that if Dan and Bob are working closely on a feature and they want to share changes locally, but they don't want to push them out to maybe a centralized area, they can create remotes for each other and keep an eye on what they're doing and merge with that work completely independently of a centralized system. And I'm going to show you how to merge here in a second. So I'm still on the Bob side of things. I have a Dan/master branch. And what I want to do as a developer is say, hey, Dan created some changes. And in this case, it's really just that one commit. And we want to pull that. We want to, pull is not the right terminology. We want to merge with that branch. And so that's what we're going to do. So we're going to git merge with the state of Dan/master. And this is literally all you have to type. So if I hit enter. Yeah, if you watch my other videos, this is just Git complaining that it doesn't have the setup for this new user Bob. So let me just real quick fix that. See, I'm sort of doing this on the fly. I apologize. Okay. So the reason, as a quick aside, the reason it's prompting me for this is because when you do a git merge, it creates a commit under the hood that's a merge commit. And I'll talk about more about what that means in other videos, but for now, just know that when you git merge, a commit is created. So here we go. This is the merge commit. And because it's a merge, it's automatically filled out the message for you here, so you don't really have to do anything except save the file and exit. Here we go. Okay, so now, git merge is a command that will change files in your working directory. That's exactly what we wanted it to do. We wanted to bring in the changes from Dan/master, merge it with our branch, which is our local master branch, and change the working tree. So now if we do a git log, what we'll see here is a merge commit made by Bob, merge remote tracking branch Dan/master. And if you go in the git log and look back in history, here's the commit that Dan made. Now, you might be a little confused about what are these other two commits that came in here. And when you're new to Git, this can get a little bit confusing. But basically what happened was when Dan created the repo, and this was a few days ago, the state, if I look at git branch-a in Dan's repo, I have origin/master from the last time Dan did a git fetch, which was a few days ago. So that's what I was trying to get at before. Everything is local in Git. It doesn't have to go out to download to a central repository. So our version of origin master here is exactly what master in the origin remote was the last time I did a git fetch, which was a few days ago. But in this case, if I switch over to the Bob side, we just cloned this, remember? So this state of origin master is up to date with the clone that I performed some 10 minutes ago. And so that's what we're seeing as the difference here. If I look at this git log, 2 days ago, I made this commit. And in between that time, this development was done. And so when we did our git clone, and we got origin state, we got it at a newer head than when Dan got it over here. In Dan's repo, the head was here the last time the fetch was made. So I realize that might be a little bit confusing if you're new to Git, and if it's not exactly clear, don't worry about it because we're going to go over it a whole bunch. Let's see. So we're going to go ahead and on Bob's side, let's make a commit. Bob has already fetched and merged from Dan/master. We're going to create a commit here and go the other way, meaning Dan is going to fetch and merge from Bob's origin master. So in order to make a commit, of course, let me do a git status, we're going to have to actually change a file. And so let's just pick a file here. What do we got? Let's change a license file, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But we're going to do it anyway. Oops. Shrink this file. Now if I do a git status and a git add u, and if these commands don't make sense to you, I encourage you to go to my previous videos where I've already covered this stuff. So git commit. Changed license file, and we are going to write the file and then exit. And so remember, we're still on Bob's repo here, and if we do a git log, we'll see this new commit. And this commit is one commit ahead of our merge commit, which we just did right before it. So this would be an example where, Bob's doing some actual development and Dan wants to grab that. So we've already gone from Dan to Bob. Let's do from Bob to Dan. So I'm going to switch back to the Dan terminal here. And we're going to add the Bob remote just like we did on Bob's side for Dan. So we're going to do git remote add Bob, home, Bob, trick. Git fetch Bob. So we're going to download the information from Bob's repo, and we'll notice that we have a new remote tracking branch called Bob/master. So just like we did before, if I want to see where that's at, I can do git log Bob/master in Dan's repo and see the exact git log that we just saw that Bob had. So here's the change license file. Here's the merge commit that Bob did with Dan master. And see Dan's commit, which we did in a different video. So, and just to reiterate here, we did, in our history, we did a fetch, but we didn't do a merge and we didn't do a pull. So the working tree hasn't changed yet. All our repo knows is, hey, I have an updated state of Dan/master, but I didn't apply it to anything. So we want to apply it to our current branch, and our current branch is master, of course. So we're just going to merge with it, just like we did on the Bob side. Git merge origin/Bob. Oops, not origin/Bob. Bob/master. Misspoke and mistyped. Git merge bob/master. Okay, here we go. So, what happened was a fast forward merge, and I can talk more about this in different videos, but basically what that means is it brought in commits that were in a single linear path, and I don't know if I'm describing this correctly, but basically there were no merge points that had to happen between the development of Dan's master branch and Bob's master branch. And if that doesn't make sense right now, that's okay, because it's a little advanced. But what you can see here is what has changed in your, and this is exactly what changed in your working tree when it applied the merge. And so what happened was we saw the license change we made, and then some changes that were in the difference between the points of origin master between when Dan cloned it and Bob cloned it, like what I talked about before this. So that might be a little confusing too. But basically what we have now is a setup where Dan's repo has the ability to fetch and merge with Bob's repo whenever Bob wants. And if we switch to the Bob side, we see that Bob has the ability to fetch and merge with Dan's master branch, this is the fundamental way that Git was designed to have distributed development. In that you notice that in this system we don't need any centralized mechanism to share these commits. We can do that, and in this case you could think of the centralized mechanism as GitHub, which is the origin. So, you know, if we wanted to, we could push, and I'll talk about that in other videos, to GitHub the origin, and then, you know, Bob could push to origin, and then Dan could pull it from origin, but you don't have to do it that way. And this really gives you the power to have a handful of developers go off and try something, and they can pull from each other, and they don't have to worry about the centralized repo being affected by it, which is really cool. So I want to talk real quickly about Git pull, and make a case for, if you're new to Git, why you don't use Git pull. And I know that's a little confusing because a lot of Git tutorials sort of introduce you to Git pull first, but I'll show you why here. If you look at the man page for Git pull, you'll notice that it says something that makes sense and something kind of vague. Fetch from and integrate with another repository or local branch. So integrate with is a little confusing. Well, what does that mean? Is that a merge? And the answer is yes. I don't know why it's worded this way, but if you look at the first sentence of Git pull here, it sort of loses people quickly. So incorporates changes from a remote repository into the current branch. In its default mode, Git pull is shorthand for git fetch followed by git merge fetch head. So you're probably thinking, oh, well, that's great. I know what a git fetch is and a git merge. Well, what the hell is fetch head? And fetch head is sort of an underlying mechanism for Git that's sort of advanced, which is funny that it's in the first line here. But basically, if you look it up, you'll find that fetch head is a short-lived reference, and basically it keeps track of what has just been fetched. So that lets you do a git pull with no arguments because it has an assumed behavior to git merge with fetch head. So this is sort of why I don't like introducing people to git pull at first, because it's doing two commands in sequence with an implied third argument, you know, git pull, or I guess it's the first argument to git pull, which is called fetch head, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to beginners anyway. So I really don't like teaching git pull. In fact, I would encourage you to, however you're using Git, instead of git pull, just use git fetch followed by git merge. And that'll sort of force you to be explicit about which remote you're fetching from. Like say you have a new remote called Jim, and then it'll force you to, when you go to merge, to be specific about what you're merging with. So, as an example, you might merge with git Jim and Jim's dev branch. So I really don't want to get too deep into git pull. I really encourage you to use git fetch and git merge as an alternative, and I really think it'll help you with understanding what's actually happening in Git. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up here and say thanks for watching. My name's Dan, and I'll see you next time.